My overview was that my father, my mother, my grandpa, my grandma, which was mama and papi, gave me a purpose in life. And the purpose said, you're here to be a servant. I am. Why? That's why you were placed here. You've been here before, and now it's time for you to serve. That was kind of the way it kicked in. But the experiences of what I can share with you will explain that very fundamental question of how I got here, why I'm here, and when I decide to leave, where I'll come back. My beginning in the civil rights, what we frame as civil rights movement, was for me, we didn't use the word civil rights, the word was used freedom movement. I joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1962, which frustrated my mother, but my dad and my mom had already been involved in the liberation movement, and I, at the age of 14 and 15, was able to witness, not just witness, but to see a Dr. Martin Luther King, a Ralph Abernathy, and a group of others who would come to our house in Indianapolis and stay during certain critical periods of the movement. And all of a sudden, I'm from an experience of my dad in the liberation movement and knowing that history, I decided to get into SNCC because of the impressions that Bernard Lafayette and Chico Neblett had come to Indianapolis talking about SNCC. And I said, that's for me. And my mother said, no, that's not for you. You ought to go to college. Well, when I joined SNCC, she said, you're no longer my son. But that changed over the years. So that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and you asked the question tied in to when you talk about SNCC, I became the Southern Campus Coordinator, which meant I had to recruit all over the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. I recruited students to participate in what we call the Summer Project of the Mississippi Summer Project, which Bob Moses and others were involved in. I also was responsible for coordinating. I had colleagues like Stokely, Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobbs. I'm messing up. I'm calling out names. I'm Ivanhoe Donaldson, a whole host of them. My relationship in Selma started, though, really essentially in 1963 when the Birmingham bombing, and I always, after that, I called it Birmingham. I didn't call it Birmingham no more. Birmingham, the destruction that took place, I was in Selma. And my job still was to kind of coordinate recruiting, but then I'm located in Selma, and then Stokely comes in and a few others come in, Bob Mance and all of them come in because there was an upsurge of what I called energy of the young people, not the elderly. We had to work with the elderly, and I use the word elderly, I should have said the parents who were in their 30s and their 40s, and at the same time began to work with them, with their children, because their children had become really, really energetic toward it. Being there in the 63, Selma began to explode with a kind of energy, and you had a unique media. You had the Birmingham, then you had the Montgomery, and then you had the energy coming toward Dallas County, which was Selma. In between that, since you bring it up, Lowndes County, it was the top county, and it probably never be stated, it was the top county in the state that had 87% of the black population, but you didn't have 2% registered voters. Our obligation was to get people registered to vote. My educational preparation comes, I guess, it starts with my mommy and papi. There was a statement always said to me from my grandparents, even to my mother and to my dad, was think. They always say, stop, what you thinking? I'm trying to figure out what you're saying, what you're thinking. So consequently, that became a process of me coming to an understanding of the question as you relate. My educational was think, think, think. So if you get into that, as I grew through Indianapolis, went to school here, in Indianapolis, graduated from Tech. Then from Tech, parents took me down south to Marshall, Bishop College, and I'm down here and I'm saying, Dad, now this is unique. You either stay here or you go to Morehouse. What am I going to Morehouse for? That's an all-boys school. Okay, I'll go along. Well, I'm there for 2 years. Bam, I get tied into SNCC. My educational growth and process took place that in those experiences, I began to have a kind of what you call let's use it this kind of way, a calling, an energy to look into mysticism. And I ended up beginning to study the Bhagavatas. I began to study the various religions outside of my own father's religion of Christianity. Because believe it or not, at the age of 6, 7, and 8, I used to have dreams of being a Catholic priest. But that was the kind of thing that went on in my dynamics. And so therefore, I finished what you would say undergrad work, going into graduate school, studying at the same school Dr. King studied at, Crozer Theological Seminary, and my focus was on ethics, church ethics. Then I went on to Northwestern and continued studying the categories basically of church and community, because my focus was always in community development, economic development, and the ability to organize coming out of the civil rights, what we call the civil rights, but we called it liberation movement, and it was about economic development. I was a preacher's son. As a preacher's son, you had to try to act right, but enjoy trying to have fun like everybody else. Just don't get caught, because if you caught, you dead, or you in jail for the rest of your life. And the only time I went to jail was when I was working in SNCC. But that's a whole nother experience, because when I got arrested, the Church Federation, and I cannot call his name, who said, then they would call me Tommy. We got to get Tommy out, and we wanted him to come back to Indianapolis, and it was in '64. They brought me out of jail in Selma and brought me up here to speak to different groups, and I went to Madison, Indiana, and spoke about the movement. They enjoyed it, and a family invited me to their house, beautiful meal, and they asked me one question that shocked them. Didn't shock me, but it shocked them. They said, "We'd like to see your tail." I said, what? We know you have a tail. I said, I don't think so, but let me say it this way. I stood up and I turned around and I said, you can touch my back, my behind, there ain't no tail. But it was just interesting, because that was the concept, the mindset, because they were very proud in talking about one of their popular black persons, and they used the N-word to describe him as Charlie. And I understood that. It didn't frustrate me, because when you're living in that whole dynamic, you experience an ability to not let it embrace you. You find an inner kind of peace. And my whole kind of experiences through those phases was me working hard at studying what I call the missing years of Christ through India and through the trainings and teachings of Hindu, even Sufi, even Buddhism, which blended for me an ability to keep moving forward in what King had laid down was the nonviolent philosophy. When it was time for the charter schools, you had the mayor at that time, who? Bart Peterson. You had a whole government looking at the charter school dynamics. The National Heritage Academy had approached Indiana Black Expo about starting a charter school. Well, Charlie Williams, which we all were interrelated and tied in even to Martin University, that's a whole nother part of my history. But Charlie said, Tom, there's an organization that wants to help us with a charter school. Now, what does that mean? At that time, you had to have, number one, you had to have a certain amount of finances to build a building. NHA said, we'll bring that to you and we'll bring you the management sophistication. We said, okay, we can get a license, and we applied for a license. Got the license, the authorization, the license. NHA steps in and says, okay, we have the funds, and it starts like that. Original beginnings was with local willingness, and our first principal, fabulous. She steps right in, and at the same time, the early team kicks it right forward. Next thing we know, we're growing. Next thing to that, we're one of the top schools of NHA and Washington, D.C. Right now, we're in challenge because the uniqueness of Andrew J. Brown Academy, yes, was the name, but the purpose was to enter into an enterprise of competition, an enterprise of economic development for who? Not for the community and not for the young people. But coming back to Andrew J. Brown Academy, our challenge is before us is to continue to enhance and develop our young people, not just locally, but I'd like to see every young person at Andrew J. Brown Academy to have something you all would never think I'd ask for them to have, a passport. Because I'd all like to see them to be able to travel beyond here, because we're now a global society. And I guess I say that within the consciousness of my own consciousness that we're all of one race, and that's the human race. The Love Project is a project that I always push was teaching nonviolence. Nobody wants to touch it. I can't get the brethren or the sisters in the faith to, let's say, set up programs in teaching nonviolence. There was a Love Project started in Arkansas. And you all have to go back and check it. And they were called Love Ambassadors. They were kicking it. And this was back in the 70s. In a high school, and they started the Love Project, Let Our Violence End, which was developing educational programs for nonviolence. Nonviolence was something that I would say grasped me even to begin to move to the studies and going to India many times in respect to that whole notion of nonviolence. I don't get privileged by violating somebody. I get privileged by healing someone who's been violated. You can't find it. That was the dynamics of trying to maybe get young people, and we were starting this back in the early 20s, talked about it in 1990s, and hit the 20s. The more you bring up nonviolence, the more violence began to impact. And getting people to, even getting churches to address that, or getting organizations to address it, particularly, and I can only speak to it because I'm sticking within the realms of Indiana, kind of, sort of Midwest. There's not any discussion on nonviolence. I flew into Germany, spent a couple of days, and then flew into Johannesburg. Blew my mind. I thought I was in New York City. I'm sitting up here talking to you, and Mandela is just being released. And my purpose there is to interview him. And the question is, how did that happen, Tom Brown? Who is sponsoring you? Interesting, the Unification Church. And people will say, how did you have that? Well, I had been working with the Unification Church because it's part of my ministry of bringing faiths together. And the Unification Church wanted me to be involved in that particular initiative for Mandela coming out. So I spent almost 30 days in South Africa. But here was the fun part about it. The significance aspect was to see South Africa and to understand how 5 million whites can control 50 million people in the black experience plus the Indian experience. How it motivated me in regard to what I was doing was the fact that it only helped me to realize how I needed to get other young people to take advantage and travel and get your history. This is just South Africa. I dealt with Ghana, I dealt with Nigeria, I dealt with those other places, and each one of those areas had a unique history, and the unique history was the impact of colonialism that was on South Africa. And it is still very strong, and I did also learn the impact of what one would call the European, German, and French community and the economics of them down there. One thing that I credit in my upbringing was that ministers then in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, guess what? And women, they all worked together in the black experience. They were not competitive like it is now. There was a cooperation that was unimaginable. There was also a kind of dedication, a serious dedication, not just to the young, but to the total community. That was put on me, you know, that Tommy, this is what you're going to do. Tommy, this, I didn't say Thomas L., Dr. No, Tommy. And when folks started calling me Tommy, I get nervous because I was scared they're going to bring up my past, that I got away with something they don't know nothing about. But because I tell folks, you know what a saint is? They say, oh, Brown, what are you talking? I said, a saint is a sinner who never gave up. So that became my motto for even today. However, in regard to being involved, my involvement was because of the reputation of many of the black community workers and leaders were working together. There was no, I cannot identify competition between the ministers that I worked with up until around the 80s. There were some dynamic white brothers and sisters that worked together, and nobody was going around trying to boast about it. Nobody was trying to showboat. The help with urban involvement is a continuous dynamic. The Church Federation, that goes way back, it's trying to emerge again because, and I say that because I'm working with that, and it's an organizing strategy. It's an organizing strategy, and believe it or not, as you throw this question to me, it's an educational initiative. The challenge now is so much competition that's going on in the urban society as related to whether you're evangelical, whether you're Pentecostal, whether you're apostolic, whether you're Baptist, whether you're Catholic, whether you are, they got so many names, your community, your religions from the community, all of them now have become enterprises. And what are enterprises about? Enterprises are about not helping people in regard to character building, in regard to healing. It's all in regard to making money. And that's where we are. What is my challenge? My challenge is to be a servant and hopefully be able to organize some organizers to implement programs that are healing and not destructive. I am what? Pro-human. But the enterprise of that dynamic, and that's an urban reality for us because we got it going on in our nation. History of Indiana Christian Leadership Conference jumps back to around 1954. The movement has started. Dad is doing his thing in Indianapolis, and then all of a sudden things are happening in Alabama. You got your boycotts. You got some things happening in Arkansas, and Dad is in the movement. I'm a preacher's son. I'm trying to be just like the regular everybody else, being free from all of the attention and stuff. The Indiana Christian Leadership Conference was a movement. Take away all of the dynamics of a structured system. It was a movement because you had churches on the north side, churches on the east side, churches on the south. You had leadership on different sides of town, all joining in a movement. Now, once the movement becomes organized into a system, the movement ceases and the system becomes what you focus on. It reaches back to one of the scholars of the time that I studied, Reinhold Niebuhr. Moral man and immoral society. Man is moral, then once he becomes tied into the system, you're no longer protecting the morality, you're protecting the system. The Indiana Christian Leadership Conference was a movement. The movement created things in regard to prison reform, prison advocacy, into even the development of Indiana Black Expo, even into the development of other initiatives. But once it became locked in, it became a system. And once it becomes a system, you forget about the movement. Our themes are focused on the dynamics of social, political, ethical, spiritual issues. What we have to do is to stay on there. We just have to be organizing resources to keep us on there. It's unbought and unbossed. See, the church to me was a movement. And of course, in that ministry, I had never intended to be a pastor, because when I met them before pastoring, I was there to help them find a pastor, because I'd already done one for Eastern Star, help them find a pastor. I'd also worked with Mount Zion and helping them to find pastors. Pastoring was not my program, and that was the madness of my method. But I also recognize that I'm in Indianapolis, and that the whole idea of a movement cannot emerge or go completely forward unless you take notice of the kind of culture and see that you're in. I started a charter school with that church. I also started a camping program and nonviolence program, but they could not embrace that as ministries because we were confined to some customs and traditions. And I knew, Brown, it's time to step out and keep on going, because I operate from a principle of what we call mysticism and yoga of my ministry and movement, teaching members how to practice yoga, which is nothing but learning how to meditate and have a union with God. Yoga was taken to whether you could stand on your head or this kind of thing. No, yoga was learning how to come to a self-realization of your divineness and understanding that the kingdom of God is not out there, it's within you. Understanding the origins of what mysticism, meditation and prayer are not the same thing. So can you imagine me doing that in regard to a society that kind of resists? And I knew that there were people who were growing, but at the same time, it's time for you, Brown, to step back and let the energy move on its own.